we issued a survey very quickly after we all went remote or started to feel the impacts of COVID-19 back in March of 2020. We got an overwhelming response. Close to 1,500 people responded and shared with us some of their fears, some of their needs. And that was what we learned then helped to inform a lot of things. One, our programming, and two, the kinds of responses that funders and other support agencies were able to engage in over the coming months. We felt like it was really important to revisit those questions of, what are you experiencing and what do you need when we had moved into, the 6th or 7th month of COVID and had experienced other crises and uprisings happening over the course of that time. And what I will just say, because my colleague Sarah is going to dig into what we learned in much more detail in just a moment, but I will say that a lot of what we learned in both sets of surveys was that what nonprofits need in these moments of crises are not significantly different than what they need when we're not in moments of crises. Primarily, that is access to flexible and long-term resources, both in the form of money and also other kinds of supports, and access to experienced peers and experts who can help us to build our capacity to move through both good times and bad. So our purpose in continuing to ask these questions and to gather information about the needs of the sector are because we serve nonprofits and advisors and institutional philanthropy. So our hope is that this information is useful to all of the members of our constituencies, and that it will continue to inform how Forefront responds, how funders, how government, and how other aspects of the sector continue to support each other and continue to evolve how we are doing what we do in order to meet the moment where we are. So, with that, I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to turn it back to Susie and see if we can move on to the next item.
There we go. All right, thanks so much, Lisa. So Emily, I think, is able to see the poll. Are other folks seeing the poll? Yes, okay, great. So this is a little bit different than usual because I cannot see the results. So I'm gonna let all of you enjoy that information. I'll catch up later. I wanted to also set sort of the expectations for this conversation right here. So as I mentioned, and Lisa shared some more detail, there's a lot in this report. So the way we wanted to set it up, Sarah was our captain of research and data analysis. So she's going to guide us through some of the points that she found the most interesting. We're going to sort of present an interesting, well, first a summary, and then an interesting factoid, and then have some conversation, and then another interesting factoid, and then have some conversation. So that kind of gives you the expectation of how we're hoping the conversation to flow. And if you have any questions or concerns during the conversation, again, please feel free to use the chat. We are here to facilitate the conversation. And with that, Sarah, I think the floor is yours. I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I have a phone ringing on my computer and I can't figure out how to turn it off. So that was very poorly timed. I'm going to add Research Champion to my business cards. That's the best one someone's come up with since Information Wizard. Right, so I will share my screen at the moment so we can kind of see some of the bits of slide I would like to highlight. All right, because as Susie mentioned, we had several kind of conclusions for the survey, and I would kind of like to go into some of the bits of the survey that most informed some of those conclusions, because I feel that's kind of the most important place to highlight things. So in talking about general operating support, as has been mentioned, that has been a clear need and request from operating nonprofits for years, for a very long time. However, in this time period, it has become more pressing and more urgent, and there are several things that kind of play into that I'm going to highlight here. First was demand for services. Just over a quarter of our respondents said they'd seen participation or demand for their services decrease. Everybody else had either consistent or increased participation or demand for their services, which is, of course, going to strain organizations even more. Consider we will also see a downturn in most revenue sources that I'll show in a couple of slides. This particularly affected BIPOC-led orgs, who were even more likely to have seen starkly increased participation or demand for their services, with 61% reporting a substantial increase of some kind, compared to 42% of all other respondents. But overall, we do have a majority of people seeing either the same need they'd seen in previous years or more so. Along with that, one of the factors that was less dark than we had been expecting had been staffing changes. Far fewer respondents said that their organization had had layoffs or furloughs or people leave who weren't going to be replaced. Most organizations either added staff or said they had no staffing changes of any kind. And that is even more pronounced if you look for anticipated changes for the November to June half of the fiscal year. You'll see that overwhelmingly organizations feel that they're not going to have any staffing changes or they're going to be adding staff. So in this case, increased need, not letting people go does mean that those revenue shortfalls are, again, being stretched even thinner than revenue was in past years. This is another area where organizations kind of differ depending on where they are. Our organizations that answered who were serving Northwest, Central, or Southern Illinois were even less likely to see staffing changes, 43% reporting absolutely no change. Now, it's worth noting that those organizations also were far more likely to be in our smallest budget range and staffing size categories. So they were already organizations kind of operating with a pretty thin margin there, which probably makes it more likely that you're really not going to want to see anybody go. BIPOC-led orgs, perhaps again in response to the fact that they were more likely to see increased demand or participation, were also far more likely to have added staff. Which again, once we go to this slide where we look at revenue shortfalls, makes the fact that BIPOC-led orgs were also far more likely to see revenue shortfalls in pretty much all areas, something that makes those organizations struggle even more than everybody else. And the picture is not rosy for everybody else as well. Majority of respondents reported 15% or more decrease in fees for services or earned income. And of course, the one that was not a surprise, but is still extremely significant, special event revenue, where we have over 3/4 of respondents, 76% of those who responded, saying that they had seen special event revenue down 15% or more, and over half of respondents seeing it down 50% or more. Again, since a lot of those sorts of events are luncheons or block parties or golf challenges that are outdoors and with large crowds, generally those are the first things that were probably canceled. And while a lot of them were moved online, the same level of kind of revenue generation or investment, I think, was frequently not seen for a lot of the virtual versions of these sorts of events. Right. And the last thing kind of going into this piece of items that kind of make the general operating support request even more prominent this time were the funds received through the federal government. While the Paycheck Protection Policy Act was seen and acted upon by most organizations, any of the other offers of aid from the federal government were largely not utilized by our respondents. Now, in most cases, this is the majority of people or a very large percentage did not apply for some reason. But you'll also note that we have over 20% to over a third of respondents saying they were not eligible for specific things, or in many cases, often near 20 to 30% were not aware of these funding opportunities, which seems to be a big shortfall on the part of anybody trying to increase participation and help out organizations at this time. Right, we have a bunch of chats, so I'm going to take a minute to look at that. So I can make the presentation available, certainly. Yeah, as Susie mentioned, the full report is available on the website. So if you want to go through all of these slides, because all of the slides I am showing you are just pieces of the report. I am kind of hitting highlights for our major findings. So you can go through that to your heart's content. You can also look at the raw data if anybody really wants to look at a very large Excel file. But that is definitely available there. All right. So that is kind of a lot of the things that went into the recommendation of highlighting the need for general operating support and why it seems even more urgent and clear at this time than it has in the past, even though it has been a consistent need for a very long time. Does anybody have any kind of questions they'd like, anything they wanted clarified or gone over, or if they want to contribute any of their personal view or experiences with their organization on anything related to what I was just going over there? All right, well, feel free to put anything in the chat at any time.
Hey, Sarah, can I jump in and sort of
absolutely.
build on your question? I think when our internal team was looking at this data, one of the things that really jumped out to several of us was particularly this access to federal support. I was wondering if anyone could help us kind of fill in the colors in this painting of, what your experience was with if you applied for aid and received it or didn't receive it, if there were programs that you weren't aware of, if anybody has some detail they'd like to share. One of the things that we are doing with this is it helps inform our advocacy work as well as our conversations with funders across the state. So all of the additional information that folks can add is super helpful as we advocate for this sector. A couple of notes in the chat as well. Thank you for those.
All right. Well, again, if anybody thinks of anything or if you are furiously typing, please make sure to still share it in the chat. But kind of moving on a little bit, I backed up to the federal funding slide, so we'll move past that again. So we also asked everybody to kind of rate support they'd received from their funders and to kind of rate those same areas of support in how useful you would find them in the immediate future. So for this, of course, sad to note that a lot of these were not offered by any funders that the respondents were aware of. So you'll see a lot of these where our orange pie piece on the left-hand side for actually receive support. That will mean that that was not something that any of the respondents felt was offered from any of their funders. You will see extremely few slices of the pie that are green. People, by and large, do not find any of these types of support unhelpful in any way, which is to be expected, but is necessary to kind of get the full picture there. So for those as well, my best fun fact for part of the survey is the fact that I mentioned that very few people found things unhelpful. For desired funding in the future, in any of these kinds of types of support, again, extremely few people ever felt that something would be harmful. However, we had precisely 0 respondents who thought that simplifying applications would be a harmful step for anyone to take. So that is a note for funders that absolutely no one feels that you're going to be making a misstep if you simplify an application more than it is at this point in time. That was also one of the types of support that seemed to be most on offer, with nearly half of respondents saying that at least one of their funders had offered that type of support. So it's good to see that one of the most universally approved of was also something that was on offer for a lot of people. Also, unsolicited additional funding, again, not on offer, but to about half. But again, 40% of people actually had that offered and found it helpful, of course, because that falls into our general operating type of bucket. These kind of unsolicited additional funding offers is, of course, also one that people feel is the most helpful as well. And the last thing to say about general operating support, we did just ask about that at one point, and it is the one that people find urgent and important to the largest degree. 72% of respondents saying that receiving general operating support in the future is both urgent and important. I'm very curious about the 6% of respondents who find it not needed. I would really like to know how very well established their organizations are that they don't feel they need any general operating support in the future. That is something to explore, perhaps. If you are one of the organizations who were one of these 6%, please reach out. I would love to talk to you about your organization. Right, so the second kind of finding after the need for general operating support was looking at long-term commitments and collaboration. This came up in the report in several ways. A number of commenters expressed wariness or concern that once the kind of emotional high, the immediate crisis of the pandemic was over, that funders would stop with some of the changes they had made or would revert to previous patterns, and that this would not be an opportunity to make kind of lasting positive change that they felt could happen. So there was a lot of that, there was a lot of concern that there would be a return to a status quo that was really not working for a large number of people. So that came up, especially in comments where people were mentioning that they would like to see some of the additional generosity, some of these changes on simplifying and communicating to continue, that these kind of needed to be part of a long-term relationship change, tying funders and their grantees more closely together. I feel it also kind of comes up in our slide where we were asking people about what kind of capacity building support they were interested in. Again, far and away, the top response was fundraising, which again, not unexpected, but is clearly tied into the idea of a long-term commitment, since that is something that is ongoing and continuous for organizations. But again, we had nearly 80% of respondents rated as being important, either also urgent or at least important, if not urgent. Interestingly, the ones that also get the widest spread of being considered important in some fashion are also ones that point to needs for long-term change and long-term collaboration relationships. Because again, the one that has the most positive support past that is collaborations or strategic partnerships, with again, over 70% of respondents rating it as important in some way. Anti-racism or racial equality, again, nearly 70% of respondents rated it as being important, and that is one that is definitely tied to long-term lasting change. The work being done in those areas is something that requires a basis and a lot of commitment. Interestingly, volunteer management is the one that the largest number of people felt is not needed at this time. 45% of people felt not needed. There, however, were still a couple of commenters who specifically said they did want it, enough so that they commented in addition to rating it on the scale here. But other things that were rated as, important by large numbers of people, you also get technology, leadership development, as well as planning and risk management, all of which are kind of long-term building up organizations for the long haul sorts of topics as well. So a lot of this just kind of ties into the idea of needing commitments that are lasting. All right, so we will pause again there. If anybody has questions or anything they would like to add, or any kind of they'd like to share anything they've received, or any kind of any kind of work that they have done or participated in on these topics that they feel that other people would find helpful, please feel free to share.
Thanks, Sarah. If I can build on that, again, one of the other things our team is looking at, for folks that have known Forefront for a long time, we in the past have had a large number of programs on professional development and nonprofit management best practices, and trying to be aware of, Zoom fatigue that is very real for many of us, and yet balancing that out with the need to connect with our community. We know that lots and lots of folks in the nonprofit world and beyond have felt really isolated and alone in this last year. And so we want to balance that out of what programs are most impactful and most helpful. So, thinking about these needs, again, if you can think about in your own experience, what programs would actually add value to your day-to-day experience? What conversations would be helpful for you? We'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And of course, if folks don't to unmute themselves, they are welcome to enter it in the chat, but we'd really love to hear your voices.
Right, and I know Emily was able to see the poll. Was she able to share the results of that as well? Because I know I saw it pop up at some point to fill out, but I don't believe I ever saw results. So, aha, yay. So hopefully can other people see the poll results as well? Just double check that is not just me. Great. So we will backtrack all the way to when we were doing this poll, just to kind of look at who is here at the moment. So have a lot of people who are in development or who are leading the organizations. It's a very nice spread over small to large organizations there.
Hey, this is Jessie Gottsteiner from MapsCore. Can I ask a question?
Certainly.
I apologize if I missed this. What has been the dissemination of these results to funders, and have you had conversations with them about
That's a
the
great
results?
question. So the report is available on our website to everyone. Also, I will be doing a version of this chat in just a couple of days on our regularly scheduled funders call. So we will be discussing the side of it and their priorities at that time as well. So we are definitely trying to push that out and engage with them on that sort of topic as well.
Oh yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you.
All right. So Deirdre asked, are these priorities triangulated with where layoffs and furloughs occurred, or is there any indication boards thought they could compensate for paid staff versus hiring more? So I did not try to correlate this question to that question. That could be an interesting thing to see if there was any kind of correlation between organizations that did see those furloughs and layoffs with ones that prioritized fundraising or volunteer management as urgent important. I would expect that if they were trying to do something like that, that they would find it both important and something that needed to be done very soon. No, I can't say that I specifically tried to correlate those two, unfortunately. We looked at kind of a lot of things based on some of the comparisons between organizations that had increased requests, need, demand for their services, as well as looking at BIPOC-led versus non-BIPOC-led organizations, and also looking at geographically based, those in the Chicago area versus those in northwestern, central, and southern Illinois were kind of our main areas of focus. But it certainly could be interesting to go back and do some of these more granular, specific comparisons of questions So thank you for the suggestion, but no, I do not know of any correlation there at this time. All right. Does anyone else have anything they would like to ask or to share? So Julie asks, "Has anticipated the events of the past year will influence funders to rethink their requirements?" I know that is certainly an ongoing conversation. I've seen any number of things in discussions aimed at and from funders talking about the need for kind of systemic change and overhaul. We will see how that goes in the future, but I know that is definitely on the minds of at least some funders. So we can hope that that does, result in some really good change in the coming months.
Can I offer a quick perspective for the team, for the group here?
Absolutely.
Coming from leading a foundation, I can say that at the foundation that I formerly was the Evanston Community Foundation, totally rethinking how grant making happens and those requirements, having switched from program and capacity building to general operating. So I know within a small community of organizations that, or foundations that like release their restrictions, they're really evaluating. The big question was that a good thing, or did it provide, or did it create more difficulties for operating nonprofits? And so the conversation is happening, especially among those foundations that quickly changed their requirements in the midst of this. So it is a conversation, it's a ripe conversation. And as Sarah said, we'll find out more later this week what the thoughts are behind those.
Yeah, as kind of Monique was mentioning there, as we were looking at the previous slide on supports that people have received, there were a number of respondents who said that their funders had simplified applications or extended deadlines or any number of changes. So since there are definitely funders who have made a lot of these changes in requirements and reporting, will probably be seen how they feel about the results that came out of that and how that conversation moves forward when discussing what the changes were from their side on what they've seen after they made those changes. So it is still an ongoing conversation. Hopefully it will bear a lot of good progress in the future.
Hi, this is Elizabeth Norden from Mercy Home for Boys and Girls. Can I ask a quick question?
Certainly.
Just as you mentioned on those previous slides, I know it, so those actually, so for funders that reduce the restrictions on reporting or, funded earlier than they were. So it's that it both happened and it was found to be helpful. I'm just a little confused, so it's both of those pieces?
Yeah, these slides, I just scrolled back through to the slides in question. Yes, they can be very confusing. So let me try to jump in to explain them just a little more. So this is actually combining two questions with kind of side-by-side comparisons. First, we asked people to rate past support that was provided by funders. So they should be rating things that they received. That's why they could rate it as being helpful, neutral, unhelpful, or not offered. So the orange section of the pie are the people who said that that particular kind of support was not offered by any of their funders. The rest of the pie, though, should be people telling you how they felt about the support that they actually did receive from at least some of their funders, whether they thought it was helpful, reducing stress and or freeing up staff time, that it was neutral, that it didn't really change much for them, or that it was unhelpful, that it added stress or took additional time that was ill afforded right now. So that's the left-hand column for these couple of slides. Then the right-hand column is kind of future projections. We kept a lot of the same types of support, but we kind of asked people how they felt about them in more kind of abstract terms. Whether you thought that they were urgent, important, that they were both something that needed to be done immediately, that they were urgent, and that they were both also important, and that they would address a systemic or kind of larger scale sort of need. So you could rate something as being both urgent and important. You could rate it as being important, that it addressed a big important change, but that it was not really urgent. It was something that could take more time. It could kind of be a, we will get it done, we will work on it, but it's going to be kind of in the background for a very long time, as opposed to something that needs to get done right this second. You could rate something as being urgent, but not important, that it was something that needed to be done right now, but it didn't really address any kind of larger change. You could rate it as neutral, that it did not really need to happen at all, or you could rate it as harmful, that it would be something that if done would actually produce stress or in some other way, harm the fortunes or the chances of nonprofits for various things. So those are kind of the comparisons. So the left-hand column should be things that people either tell us they didn't have on offer from any funders or are rated by how helpful they thought they were from a funder. Whereas the right-hand column is kind of a abstract, in the near future, how would you think about these particular types of support? Hopefully that makes a little more sense.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So yeah, so for say the early payment on pledged grants, 61% of people did not have that on offer. 24% of people did and thought it was very helpful. How people feel about it, 41% of people don't think that is a particularly needed area, whereas again, around 24-25% think it is urgent and important. So those are just kind of some comparisons there. As I mentioned when I ran through them, perhaps a little too quickly before, extremely few people find any of the categories that we asked them about to be either unhelpful if they receive them, or to be something that would be harmful just kind of in general. So for the left-hand side, the kind of green are people who felt that they received this kind of support, but that it was really not great, that it was something that actually made things more stressful or more time consuming. And on the right-hand side, the very light blue is something that people feel might generally be harmful. So again, none of the categories we asked about were things that people generally thought would be either harmful or that they thought had in the past been unhelpful. So that's kind of those slides a little more in detail. All right.
Thank you.
No problem. Please, if anybody needs anything else clarified, feel free to ask. I've looked at these for a very long time, and I am sure a lot of what I am thinking about them is just in my head and not coming out very clearly. So if there's anything where you want to go, well, that didn't make sense, please tell me how that actually worked. Let me know. I will be more than happy to go over any of this in a little more detail. All right, so as you mentioned, general operating support is very important, even more so now than ever. Long-term solutions, collaborations, partnerships are also extremely important, both just in terms of stability and in terms of accomplishing needed change. And finally, one of the things that was interesting to find was that when looking at capacity building support, how people generally wanted to engage with it tended to be either from experts presenting or from peer networks. Interestingly, on here, so you'll note that our three categories, very beneficial, somewhat beneficial, or not beneficial, are how they are presented here. Consulting with an outside expert was the one that the largest percentage of people felt was very beneficial. That changes slightly with one of the groups we looked at. Organizations that serve Northwestern, Central, Southern Illinois were the only ones who did not rate that the most highly of all of the categories. Instead, their largest preference was for webinar series taught by experts, which was still very highly rated by other respondents, but fell in second place for everybody else. Whereas for reasons that if anybody on the call is from those areas, and if you have a preference that falls into that same kind of line, if you think a webinar series presented by an expert is better than consulting from expert, if you would care to share kind of your view on what the difference between those is and why one of them is better than the other, please feel free to share that. Honestly, if anyone has kind of feelings about these particular offerings and what they see as most beneficial or what they've experienced in the past and what help they've gotten from it. Please feel free to share that as well. Specifically also for our other kind of demographic concentration, BIPOC-led organizations actually rated it as 51%, considering it very beneficial, the consulting from an outside expert compared to respondents as a whole was one that was felt to be even more beneficial there than the overall audience found it.
I have a question.
Certainly.
Hi, Veronica Bloom from Love Is Here. These results, when did these come in? Because obviously as the pandemic went on, like web series and stuff were much more willing to, that's the way I wanted to receive stuff. So where in the gamut of this year were these results grabbed from?
So this survey was up during September, October, I believe. Susie or Lisa, if you have exact dates you remember offhand, please let me know. That's why in a couple of the areas where we asked people about what had happened versus their projections, we were asking them about March through October and then November through June, because November through June was the future at that point in time. So it's kind of in that realm is when we were asking this. So people had had time to both get used to webinars, prefer them over in-person things, and possibly burn out a little bit on them by the time they were answering this survey. Which might be why you have people wanting kind of the consulting sessions, because you could still do that virtually, but it'd be more one-on-one and a lot more conversation-based than webinars often turn out to be. But also kind of interestingly on this, while that was the one that was highest rated for the very beneficial category, the one that most people found to be beneficial overall is actually the peer learning. So that was something where over half of people found it somewhat beneficial and another quarter found it very beneficial. So that is an area where that kind of peer learning or even the webinar workshop series with peer learning built into it were also seen as being very useful sorts of things. Hence our kind of mention that expert advice as well as learning from peers were both things that people had a lot of interest in. So this is one where those are kind of the two things, especially for us as an organization that does a lot of programming, that kind of helps us think about what it is we want to try to host and facilitate for others, because it's kind of very clear that people in general are wanting people who have experience, either as kind of experts in the field or as peers who have been through this sort of thing or who are working through it at the same time so you can learn from one another. So that was kind of a very clear result there. So just mention real quick, the categories that had the least interest for people were the kind of long webinar workshop series. A 4 to 6 month one, 32% of people did not feel that was beneficial, quite possibly just for the amount of time and investment that would show. I know some of the comments were very much of we're already stretched thin, we don't have a lot of time to dedicate to these things. So I think a lot of the kind of longer offerings had a higher negative rating just because of the amount of time, not necessarily because of the format. All right, so if anybody else has kind of comments about this, or again, past experiences they have they'd like to share, or preferences of their own they would like to discuss about that, or honestly, any other questions about anything we have discussed up to this point, please feel free to add them. I'll have more water. All right, doesn't sound like we have any kind of questions there. So honestly, that kind of was me going over our 3 main findings in general: the need for general operating support, the interest in and kind of concern that funders may not be as invested in long-term commitments and solutions, and the idea that the best kind of resources are ones that are built on expertise or peer learning where people can work and learn together. So open up for any kind of comments or questions, or if anybody has glanced at the survey and wants to talk about any other part of it, please feel free. We can certainly do that as well.
Great. I see that Lisa just posted the link to the full report. So if folks, again, haven't had a chance to look at it, it is available on our website. I also wanted to open up something, a question we often start our membership orientations with is, what brought you here today? Was there a particular question you were hoping to answer? So if anyone would like to share or ask, was there an idea you were looking for? Something you just wanted to hear how other folks are doing? I know, ourselves being the State Association of Nonprofits, we've been talking to other state associations, to get a sense of, what experience are you having? Is what we're going through normal? Should we be expecting something different? Sometimes it's just really helpful to normalize the experiences of the harder things that we're focusing. So anything that you folks are willing to share, and I see some in the chat, and thank you for that. Also wanted to mention, and I might put Lisa on the spot a little bit because I know Emily has to actually jump off the call. We are relaunching Peer Skillshare shortly, which is a program to connect members with one another to answer short questions. Lisa, would you be able, I apologize for the on-the-spot question, but would you be able to share a little bit more about how that program works and what folks can look forward to in the next couple of weeks?
Absolutely, and I am always happy to talk about Peer Skillshare. It's a super exciting program, I think, and I hope you all will agree with me when you get a chance to experience it directly. So Peer Skillshare, as Susie mentioned, is a program that we're getting ready to launch. So look for emails about that soon, especially if you are already a member. And it is essentially a matching service. So the title of the program is very self-descriptive. It is a program where we match people who work in the social impact sector, who have a need, whether usually a shorter sort of technical assistance need, whether it's I need to revamp this survey, the questions that I'm writing, or we're trying to work on a particular kind of fundraising campaign, and I have questions about how to start or how to deal with this particular aspect of it. It can be anything from really technical to, we're trying to rewrite our diversity statement and I need somebody outside of the organization to bounce this off of who has experience doing the same thing. So a huge range of possible skills that you can offer help on or get help on. So pretty soon we're going to be asking folks to volunteer themselves as potential advisors. So that's an opportunity to get to share your skills and your experience to make connections with other professionals across the state. And then we'll open up the doors for requests from folks who need your support. The Skillshare sessions are meant to be 1 to 2 hours. So not something that's a long ongoing commitment, but really an opportunity to, again, make a specific request to get some specific help. And then hopefully build those relationships. That's one of the outcomes that we hope will occur, but not a requirement. So as you see that request come out soon for advisors, we hope you'll consider, what am I good at? What have I had experience about, and what might be willing to support another peer in learning and developing around. So that is going to be a free program for any Forefront member, whether you're a nonprofit, an advisor, or a grant maker. So we look forward to engaging you all on that. And if there are questions about it, please feel free to throw those in the chat, or you can ask Susie or me anytime.
Thanks, Lisa. And I want to echo and really emphasize that point about who can be an advisor on peer Skillshare. You know, something I've experienced in my personal work as well as from comments from our membership is that folks are really looking for ways to network, but don't want to go to networking events. You know, to show up in a room or a virtual room and try to have a conversation and get to know people with sort of no context, it can be really hard for some folks. But peer Skillshare is a really interesting opportunity because, as Lisa said, it's a great way to share the knowledge that we have as individuals. And it's also a way to get to know someone. I know, you know, when I used to, back in the day when we were in person, show up to those networking events, I had to really psych myself up of like, okay, I'm going to talk to at least 5 people that I don't know. But if I have something I'm talking about that I have knowledge of, and I know that that person is interested in talking about it, you know, it's so much easier to start a conversation. So we really encourage folks to join as advisor members, even if you aren't a consultant, just to share the knowledge that you have as an individual and maybe get to know some other great professionals in the sector. Sarah, have you gotten a chance to see this very interesting question in the chat? I'm going to take it that you're reading that one right now. So the question about how consultant advisors can take away from these findings is really interesting, and one that honestly I have not thought about yet. So thank you for sharing that one. Sarah, do you have any thoughts you want to add?
So it had not been kind of the particular tack we'd really considered yet, but I'm certain, especially as we build out our programming, especially with, say, like the Ask an Advisor series that we've been doing over the past months, that there's definitely space for advisors to be involved in these sorts of sessions and capacity building supports. Since, again, expert advice was one of the more highly rated kinds of support from most respondents. So consultants are frequently seen as those sort of experts. So I think there's definitely space there for being involved in these kind of sessions, offering that expertise or working with kind of nonprofits in general on that kind of capacity building on the areas that have been in question, you know, the fundraising or the human resource management, or a number of those kinds of topics that, again, I know we've addressed some of in the Ask It Advisory series, the recordings of which I have sent to a number of patrons as helpful links when they have asked us questions in the library recently. So that is definitely something where I think there can be a lot of involvement for consultants and advisors. Yes, and if you have ideas about specific types of programs, please talk to Susie. Thank you very much, Jill. I'm sure we'd love to keep that conversation going, very much so. Going way back to one of the very early comments, somebody had mentioned liking the idea of keeping a version of this survey going on a regular basis as kind of a rating of funders. I will note that there is one very nice site called grantadvisor.org. If you actually want to see a site that has surveys and reviews of foundations, you can post those, take the survey and write a review anonymously if you have very nice things to say or constructive sorts of things to say about foundations. They have a large number of kind of profiles on organizations there. So if you actually want to kind of contribute to that sort of community, I know of that site that actually does that on a very kind of real-time basis. Yes. Oh, and Lisa has helpfully put a link to all of the Ask a Consultant videos in the chat. So if anybody wants to check those out, I believe our most popular one at this point is talking about hiring a grant writer. So, but there's a lot of talk there about kind of social justice, about work from home, any kind of number of topics that we've had our lovely friends from ACN and other consultant members of Forefront discuss for us.
Great. Thanks so much. So I think we're getting close to the end of our time for today. As always, I hope that Forefront programs provide the information that folks are looking for. I hope that you'll be able to take a deeper dive into the report and let us know if you have questions or feedback. And most importantly, I hope that today you felt a little bit more a part of the community with the folks that were here. I know we were still a little bit quiet, and that is totally okay. But just to see some other faces and know that you are not alone in your day-to-day work, I really take heart in that, and I hope you do too. I wanted to highlight one other program coming up in case there are folks on the call today that are not as familiar with Forefront and the other benefits of membership and the community. On February 9th at 10 a.m., we have a program. You'll see my face again, and Sarah and Lisa, definitely, for our virtual member benefits orientation. So that's another great conversation about other resources that Forefront can provide to support you and your team. And so with that, I think if we don't have any other questions, I'll just say thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Bye, everybody.